Ah yes, ultra settings. Both a blessing and a curse hanging over your head as you sit there in the menu. Some of you may even suffer from an existential angst due to these ultra settings. What is the point of playing a game if I can't play it on ultra, you may ask yourself. Am I missing out if the game is not on ultra settings? Of course not. And not everyone has a monster rig with a Titan XP or two where they can just set it to ultra and leave it without a worry. So ultra settings, yeah, they future-proof. They turn on unique but expensive experimental features. They crank up view distances, FX resolutions, or sample counts to high levels. But above all, they're expensive, and of questionable value at times when it comes to bang for your buck visual performance. When are you getting a visual return greater than or equal to the performance sacrificed? Sure, that's a subjective question, but it is important to ask when you have more limited mid-range hardware resources. So in this video, I thought it would be time to look into different types of ultra settings, what the ultra settings tend to do, and hopefully giving you, the viewer, enough information to make more informed decisions about where to spend precious GPU resources, when ultra is worth it and when ultra is not worth it. Specifically, I will highlight those types of ultra settings in games where you more often than not can turn them down without having a huge impact on visual fidelity. The test rig for this video is a suitably mid-range i5-8400 at stock settings with an NVIDIA GeForce GTX 1060 from MSI, 16GB of RAM at 2667 MHz, and all on an SSD. So let's get into the first type of ultra settings to look out for, post-processing. Differences in post-processing in a game tend to be rather subtle when moving between settings for the most part. A great example here is Crysis 3. When moving to high and very high in Crysis 3, the depth of field changes over to a bandwidth-heavy, sprite-based bokeh depth of field. So on high, you're still getting a bokeh effect, but the very high one is technically more accurate. Likewise, when moving from high to very high, motion blur renders instead at a higher resolution, with more samples and a better masking, so objects do not blur in areas where they're not supposed to, as you can see here on the tip of this shotgun when spinning around. But unless you are really paying attention to such things in the heat of the moment, you're not exactly getting a huge difference in visuals by going from high to very high with this game's post-processing. Arguably even going to very high has some aesthetic detriments, as the sprite-based bokeh depth of field on very high in Crysis 3 does not apply to the rear of the weapon view model like the high version does. Nor does it apply consistently at all when using aim-down sights in the game. So in the end, it ends up being a subjective aesthetic choice in a lot of ways when moving between high and very high here. But one thing that is objective about the move is how it performs. Here in this cutscene at 1080p on the test rig, the very high post-processing runs at its worst around 11% worse than when running at very high. That is enough of a performance differential to be concerning if you're targeting a rock-solid 60 FPS in a game. And interestingly, since post-process settings are very much so bandwidth heavy in most games, the more bandwidth starved your GPU is, the heavier that performance differential will be when moving between high and very high. So perhaps your GPU is already being hit hard in the bandwidth department at your default gaming resolution, or maybe you want to downsample the game from a higher resolution while targeting a lower frame rate. Here we can see that effect in Crysis 3 when moving up to 4K resolution. Whereas at 1080p the performance differential was at worst 11%, at 4K it increases to a whopping 25% just by using very high. All that performance for just ticking up one setting, and one setting that you really can't notice. The principle from Crysis 3 here carries across to other games, such as those on Unreal Engine 4 where you can often control the quality of post-processing separate or the quality of motion blur separately, adding more samples and higher precision as you move up to ultra settings. The principle applies just as well to other types of post-processing as well, beyond motion blur and depth of field. Screen space reflections are a great example of this and often follow the exact same progression. Check out here in Watch Dogs 2 for example. By going from ultra to very high, medium, you can see a gradual reduction in their sharpness and accuracy, yet lowering the detail setting of the medium has them working and still looking pretty okay. And by going from normal to ultra here, you're looking at a performance loss of around 13% in this scene. And if you zoom in close, the actual difference in visuals is not exactly so stark between what is the lowest setting and what is the highest. So the quality of screen space reflections is definitely an area where you can save performance by forgoing ultra settings for something that is just more reasonable. Unlike post-processing, shadow settings in games are not exactly transparent and can be a double-edged sword. On the one hand, you can have ultra shadow settings which push out the distance at which shadow cascades render. This is great for games with long view distances where you spend a lot of time outdoors and are engaging in gameplay which isn't exactly at short distances. The Witcher 3 here is a great example of this, where putting up the shadow settings makes outdoor scenes so much more realistic and natural looking. The view distances though in general in The Witcher 3's gameplay are very high, and sure you engage in medium range gameplay through questing and combat, but you're often just spending so much time traversing and enjoying the vistas. So putting this one setting up to ultra is probably actually worth it in this case here, as it makes those outdoor areas that you spend so much time in so much nicer. But it doesn't exactly come cheap. As you can see here in the shot in Skellige, pushing up the shadows from medium to ultra shows a performance loss of around 15%. Like I said though, in The Witcher 3 you spend a lot of time outside looking at those vistas. But if a game has you spending most of your gameplay looking at objects at close to medium range, like in Wolfenstein the New Colossus, then turning down that shadow setting from ultra to a lower setting is a smart way to claw back performance while not losing a lot of visual fidelity. For example, look at the scene here in the Manhattan level of the game. When moving from über to high, you get nearly a 25% increase in performance for surprisingly little loss in visual fidelity of the shadows, either from afar, as seen here, or a surprisingly small loss in fidelity of shadows close to the camera, as seen here. Like I said though, shadow options in game are not exactly transparent always. They can also turn up the internal resolution of a shadow map and its cascades. So instead of using a 1024 by 1024 resolution shadow map for the one closest to the camera, it can turn it up maybe to 2048 by 2048 or maybe even higher. This makes the shadows look cleaner and much more precise in motion, as they will not wobble around as the resolution is too low. But it can also make shadows arguably too sharp in some instances and look less realistic. Sure, having nice, tight shadows on small objects where the shadow is close to the source casting it is great, like it is here in The Witcher 3 on these face shadows here. But having extremely sharp shadows from a tree which is many meters tall, or as many meters away, is pretty unrealistic. So if a game does not offer the ability to simulate this umbra penumbra effect of a shadow, like here in Assassin's Creed Unity, that is where shadows become blurrier the further away they are from the objects casting them, then turning up shadow resolution may end up making a lot of shadows in a game too sharp given the distance they are at. This applies to a lot of games out there, and I mean a lot. But a great example of this can be found in all the Serious Sam games made on Serious Engine 3, and here in the HD collection version of The First Encounter. Croteam's wonderful settings menu here allows you to adjust the shadow resolution independent from the distance at which the cascades render. So it is a great way to show off how ultra shadow resolution settings mean spending a lot of GPU time increasing the resolution of that shadow map cascade. This technically would make them more stable in motion, but you're also making that cascade so close to the camera unrealistically sharp. It's not exactly cheap, and it does not look realistic. In this scene, going from the highest shadow resolution settings to the lowest shadow resolution settings showcases a performance increase of around 20%. So you get both a performance increase here, and in many ways a visual win. Another group of ultra settings to be wary of are those controlling the distance of rendering, the density of environmental object detail, or even specifically those controlling vegetation distance. This may be called distance detail, extra detail, level of detail, or object LOD, etc. Why one should be weary of these is because these settings on Ultra tend to do two things. They lead to a constant depression of CPU performance due to increased jaw calls for more objects needing to be added into the scene, And they also have a more unexpected drop in GPU performance tied to certain scenes. One very poignant example of this comes to mind immediately. In Watch Dogs 2, setting the detail distance slider up from 0% up to an ultra level 100% showcases an increased rendering of objects into the distance, as you can see here in this comparison. So when walking around the city and pumping up this extended detail at a distance, it affects performance in a pretty big way. Just walking around here you can see a performance decrease of around 19%, where the visual difference is definitely there, but really localized in the distance. As mentioned, these types of ultra settings controlling object distances in games, though, can have a lopsided effect. So while you may be getting less than 60 FPS here in the city and thinking, I'll just lock the FPS down to 30, in the city and in other open world games like this, the performance drop will be much more steady and located a lot on the CPU side of things. More objects being drawn into the distance here means more draw calls for that CPU to take care of. And depending upon the relative performance balance between your CPU and GPU in your PC, your GPU or your CPU could maybe end up limiting your performance the higher you push up these extended detail settings. For example, a Titan XP with an FX 6300 would see the CPU limiting performance here in this scene, while a 750 Ti with an i7 8700K would have the GPU be limiting performance here. But like I said, the effect of these detail settings can be extremely lopsided, so while in this scene we see a decrease of around 19 to 20% on this more balanced configuration that I have used as my test rig, moving around to scenes with other types of objects changes that up radically. Here outside the city looking into the forest, the performance difference between normal distance detail settings and those on Ultra skyrockets up to a decrease of 50%. So while you may have thought you could have locked this game to 30 FPS due to your performance in the city, the countryside can prove otherwise. The reason why this happens is because your PC is dealing with a very different type of workload that it does not have in the city. In the city, vegetation is sparse, but on the countryside there's so much more of it, and increasing the view distance for vegetation means a lot more bandwidth-heavy alpha textures needing processing on your GPU, to the point where there's way too much of it. So be wary here of extending the draw distance in a game for certain objects, as it may end up leading to areas where your performance is pretty okay, to areas where the performance is really, really terrible. And the last group of ultra settings to be mindful of is those controlling texture quality. The way texture quality performs tends to be very different though in comparison to other settings I have mentioned up to this point. And looking close at textures here in Deus Ex Mankind Divided, it's really hard to see any clear differences when moving from very high to ultra texture settings here. In terms of performance though, the difference between ultra and one step lower can sometimes be drastic to the point of unplayability. If the amount of VRAM available, that is the amount of memory on your GPU, is less than the amount required to display those higher resolution textures, textures will instead be pulled from your main storage device, which means you'll get hitching every single time that happens. This is a bit hard to show on the 6GB card I have here in the test rig in most games, but the very highest textures in Deus Ex can end up using more than 6GB of VRAM, depending upon the scene, which you can see here on the on-screen display as the amount of VRAM used crests 6GB as we move into the square, and this card only has 6GB of VRAM. This is not the case when just using very high settings here, where VRAM levels stay below 6GB. So unlike other Ultra settings mentioned up to this point, you don't see a constant depression in performance when going up to Ultra here. Rather, you see periodic hitching. In this scene, there are occasional hitches introduced as textures swap in and out of memory on the fly here. This would increase with the less VRAM a video card would have. So very high settings on the other hand here, where VRAM stays below 6GB, does not showcase this additional stutter, as frame times stay smooth. So Ultra for texture settings in a game is definitely not worth it if it will introduce hitching for a very small visual return, like it is here in Deus Ex Mankind Divided. But to ensure that, you really have to pay attention to the amount of VRAM numbers you could see on an on-screen display and know how much VRAM your card has. So to this point, we've seen how different types of ultra settings in different games can either enhance the image a lot, but cost a lot, such as in The Witcher 3 with its shadow settings, or how ultra settings can also be of questionable visual value for their performance, as is shown in Serious Sam The First Encounter HD with its shadows, or in Crysis 3 with its post-processing option. The way quality settings work though for the most part for things like post-processing, shadows, object detail in the distance, etc., are generally very similar across most games. So I thought it would be best here to take a look at one game as a summation of sorts, combining all the principles I discussed earlier for the individual types of ultra settings. When just walking around this geothermal valley area here in Rise of the Tomb Raider, we get performance ranging in the 40s up to the low 50s on very high settings. This is what could be considered ultra in this game, let's say. And just as other games I highlighted earlier, a few small nips and tucks to various settings though can help performance a lot, for very little loss in visual quality. So here I adjust down the shadows to high, turn down sun shadows to just on so the feature is not disabled, yet still applies to the full image. I also adjust down post-processing setting of depth of field here from very high to on, turn distance detail settings or level of detail from very high to high, and adjust dynamic foliage down one peg to medium. I also turn down here pure hair to on instead of very high, so I leave the feature on, but without pushing it too far ahead of what my hardware can do. In the end, after this tweaking, I'm left with an image which generally looks a lot like the very high one. Quite similar, right? Shadows still look good, Lara still looks pretty great, and the core rendering is intact and not sacrificed in the feature set. That is, I'm not turning off a feature that is present in the other one. It looks really similar, and walking that same path I did earlier, you can see how we gained around 20% performance over very high settings here, all while the game looks extremely similar. And if you look at how a GTX 1070 would run this exact same scene on very high settings, you see something funny. The gain in performance from tweaking down settings like this is almost like upgrading your graphics card to the next number better, and in this case, it's a bit like having a slightly slower version of a GTX 1070 in your PC, all just by being smart with how you set your settings. The principle behind tweaking down settings is one that applies to every game out there. So next time you are in a graphics menu, do not panic. Do not feel the pressure to turn everything up to ultra because you fear you may be missing out on the game experience or some feature. Most ultra settings in most scenarios add finer, precise detail, but at a great cost usually, and going that extra step can be a step one too far on mainstream hardware. So really don't panic, and just set it down to high instead of ultra. So with that being said, I would like to thank you for taking the time to watch this video. If you like what you saw and heard, hit that like button, ring the bell in the corner, and subscribe to the channel. If you would like to discuss ultra settings with me in any capacity, write a comment below, or follow myself and Digital Foundry on Twitter. This is Alex, bidding you farewell und auf Wiedersehen.